would love to spend the next 3 weeks studying these art movements in depth. Cubism, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, they're completely revolutionary in the way that they approach paint, completely revolutionary in the way they answer the question, what is art? Now this question is going to be extraordinarily important this week, and it's going to be constantly considered. What is art? First topic for this week. Now, in order to sort of get into this conversation in depth, we sort of have to continue this conversation of abstraction and sort of how abstraction functions within art and how abstraction is going to become more and more the subject of the paintings and more intense in the way that you have to understand abstraction to be able to understand the paintings. Now, of course, as always, in order to have a solid understanding of what's going on in art, it's going to be necessary to have a solid understanding of what's going on in the history of the world at this time. This is an extraordinarily tumultuous time period. As revolutionary as the Renaissance, as revolutionary as the French Revolution, the American Revolution, as revolutionary as the Industrial Revolution, this is World War I, World War II, the entire world being involved in conflict, sort of engaging in some of these main questions as what does it mean to be a state? What does it mean to have control? What does it mean to be able to rule people? What does it mean to be able to rule culture? What does it mean to be able to rule civilization as we know it? We're going to be seeing characters pop up and take over the world and then be completely wiped out. We're also going to see another critical change. When we started this story a couple of weeks back, we were in Italy. Then the subject sort of changed, the style of art sort of changed, and the center of the art world is going to move to Paris, France. Now, by this point, by the end of today's story, we're going to be in New York City. Another key change, because the place where art is being made is always affecting art. The fact that the center of art is going to move to New York City is going to be sort of critical to our understanding of next week's subject matter. So, to review, this week we're going to be discussing the big question, what is art? That's going to be different than it was last week. Number 2, abstraction, also different than last week. 3, revolution, again, different than last week. What is art? I thought that we've been discussing art this entire time. We've actually obviously only been discussing a very narrow portion of art, which is painting. Now, painting is great, and it allows us to understand one key thing about art, and when we look at a museum, the paintings are what's probably going to grab our attention. Obviously, when I walk through and give you a tour, you'll see that I'll be bouncing back and forth to a certain degree between painting and sculpture, but this class has been about painting, so let's concentrate on that for a time being. Now, when we've been discussing art, specifically in terms of painting, what we've actually been really discussing is this finely tuned set of craftsmanships, right? The ability to use pigment and swish it around with some oil and then let it harden with some resins to create an image. And so we've been celebrating this craftsmanship, this amazing ability for humans to be able to render reality or fantasy, whichever it may be. But this is going to shift. Because now it's not going to be all about, and starting last week, it actually started to shift, but it's not going to be all about just amazing craftsmanship, but also sort of about creative uses of that craft. Now, from Renaissance up until the sort of end of neoclassicism, paintings didn't really change that much. It was about creating that smooth, glassy surface, that perfectly rendered flat surface, three-dimensional reality, but in a completely flat surface. Now, last week when we moved into Impressionism, that switched up. Now it was about the mark making. Now, for about every 10, 20 years throughout the remainder of the 20th century, what type of marks people are going to be making is going to be changing dramatically. It's not about that smooth, glassy surface, but instead it's about experiments in mark making, experiments in image making, experiments moving away from just that three-dimensional reality in a two-dimensional space, but looking at all sorts of different things. Now, a lot of this sort of confusing conversation starts with this guy, Marcel Duchamp. He was a painter. He was making paintings that kind of looked like this, what we call Fauvism, right? Sort of a post-impressionism sort of approach to art making. You sort of see a lot of Cézanne influences and so on. he then sort of began to explore a little bit into this approach to what we'll call cubism, right? Sort of looking at the same object but from a lot of different directions, trying to bring a fourth dimension into art. Not only just length and width and this implied depth, but also sort of exploring motion, exploring time as another dimension in artwork. But it really gets confusing when he starts making things like this, right? This is a urinal. But it's a urinal that's sort of tipped on its side. And he calls this urinal fountain. Because here he's sort of trying to get you into this idea of thinking, not just looking, right? He calls his previous artworks retinal art, art that just inspires the eyes. But in this case, he's sort of trying to make conceptual art, art that inspires the mind. We could actually make an object that wasn't finely crafted by an artist, but perhaps was mass-produced by the Industrial Revolution, right? And that you could add meaning to an object like this by twisting its meaning a little bit. In this case, he was basically saying, like, look, if you flip a urinal on its side and you were to piss into it, it would pour onto your feet. It would create a fountain. It's just in your head. It's just an idea in your head. And that this idea in your head could be art too. There were people that were trying to capture a little glass vault full of Paris air and calling that art. Later on you'd have people that were like, canning artist shit and calling that an artwork because it was produced by an artist, right? Now, unfortunately, this question of what is art and what isn't art is always just embroiled in controversy. I don't want to imply that people that are still making that antiquated form of paintings, that perfectly crafted reality, that those people aren't making art, because they are. They're just making a specific style of art. But the style of art is the thing that is going to constantly be changing. And there begins to be a conversation about this new term, and this new term is called avant-garde, which is a description of artists that are sort of breaking the rules intentionally. And intentionally trying to move the goalposts, intentionally trying to say, like, oh, you thought that this was the objective over here? Well, guess what? Now this is the objective over here. Marcel Duchamp was probably one of the most avant-garde artists in that he was basically, when people think of 20th century art and how art sort of took a crazy turn, they generally are thinking about Marcel Duchamp and this Dada art movement. But it's also important to understand that Dada was actually an anti-art movement. The idea was sort of twofold. One, of course, was moving away from this idea of optical art. Now, up to this point, the whole point of art has been optical. The idea of creating something that deals with light and it bounces off the surface and bounces into your eye. How could a painter be interested in art that's not optical? That's kind of the whole point. That's a very avant-garde concept. But the other key thing that the Dadaists, and specifically Marcel Duchamp, was interested in was the idea of decommodifying art, trying to take some of the money out of art. Now, if you remember, Van Gogh was constantly sort of torn by the fact that nobody wanted any of his paintings. All artists are constantly dealing with this, right? If money is the ultimate thing that dictates whether or not something is successful, well, maybe it'd be a very avant-garde thing to try to take that out, to try to change that one key rule that's almost always been a key rule, right? Marcel Duchamp's probably most famous piece, this Cubist artwork called Nude Descending the Staircase, was actually purchased by this collector in California who purchased it strictly because it was famous. And not because he saw it. He never saw it until he owned it, right? But just strictly the fact that it was causing an uproar, the fact that it was causing a stir made him want to own it. Because artworks that are causing a stir, artworks that are causing a conversation, they become valuable. And if they're valuable, then he'll be able to make more money on it by selling it again later. This is kind of a very complicated thing, but Marcel Duchamp, looking at that, sort of saying, okay, you purchased this piece just because of the hubbub and not because you actually enjoyed looking at it. Why should I even bother making artworks that are enjoyable to look at? A lot of Dada art is extremely hard to consume. I'm going to show you a couple of seconds of it, and it is just thick, it's difficult, it is complicated, but it is changing, it's changing the way people look at art, it's changing the way people understand art, and it's making people think twice about some of the most obvious basic principles of art. The idea that it should be seen, the idea that it should be sold. Throw those two things out, now we're starting over, right? Now, we have to start over. Because before too long, we're going to be switching from Italian art to French art to American art. And American art perhaps has to have its own rules. Not to say that it doesn't stick with a lot of the same rules, and not to say that people don't try to sell the art, and they do, but they have to start by stirring it up. At all times, there's always been sort of a form of judging of one sort or another that sort of qualifies it as being more important or less important than something else. At the beginning of the conversation in the Renaissance, it was the Medicis, right? This powerful family that was paying for the art, that was hiring an artist that they thought to be important and asking them to do an extraordinarily important piece of art. In the next era, it was the Salon in France, and Salon was basically the situation where if you got in, then you were amongst the good artists, and if you didn't get in, then you were amongst the other artists, right? Now, when we get to New York, the conversation is going to be a little bit different. Now, there's always been critics, but in New York, there's a handful of critics and gallery owners that are going to become extremely powerful in sort of choosing the taste, sort of choosing what is the next art movement, sort of searching around amongst many different avant-garde artists that were all doing sort of strange things and sort of saying, that guy, the person that's doing that is the extraordinarily interesting person of the moment. Each of the three key art movements that we're going to be discussing this week are sort of famous for how they're painted differently. The Surrealists, in many cases, specifically Salvador Dali, trying to paint in a very classical Renaissance-style painting, but switching up the concepts. The Cubists, like Pablo Picasso, trying to change the basic way that we look at paintings. Instead of a 2D plane that's trying to project 3 dimensions, he's saying, let's make it flat again, right? Jackson Pollock, instead of sticking with some of the basic principles, that we're going to be working on a painting on an easel that's designed for the wall, and that we're going to try to make something that represents something. Both of those are out. He puts the canvas on the floor and he's painting just color. He's just making relationships between color and line and shape, having nothing to do with a recognizable image. These three key art movements, each threw out some of the basic rules, each were extraordinarily avant-garde in their time, each are completely what you think of when you think of modern art right now. They went from being nobodies to being the poster boys for the new art. This painting actually started as just a painting of a shovel. It was kind of a painting that was very much in the Impressionist sort of approach. I actually started working on this painting last week in the conversation about Impressionism. But now I've sort of taken a twist. The form of abstraction I'm using here, beyond just simplification abstraction, is also conceptual abstraction. Abstraction that's also in the mind, which ends up making this a tiny bit more surrealistic, right? Instead of it being just a direct representation of an object, it's sort of a blend of two different objects. The shovel for the top half and the bottle for the lower half, right? Now, when you push these two meanings together, you create a new meaning. Instead of it just being about being able to grab a hold of a handle and scoop some stuff, in this case, it's sort of about being able to grab a hold of a handle and then drink something. Not an extraordinarily complex concept, but it is clearly an abstraction. It's a surrealistic abstraction. So here's another picture that I finished up this week. On that scale of abstraction, it's probably closer to that non-representational. It's still trying to represent something, but it's pretty abstract, I understand that. In this case, I was sort of trying to experiment. Again, started this painting last week during the Impressionist era. I did definitely get very inspired by the Impressionists. Inspired to start a bunch of paintings, that's for sure. But then this one again, I also sort of took and twisted a little bit. It was originally supposed to be a microscope, right? And you can sort of see some of the elements of the microscope here. But then as we were getting into this week, started looking at a bunch of Cubist paintings, I'm like, what the heck? Maybe I'll play with a couple of Cubist tricks. Amongst them is this idea of trying to communicate this from a lot of different angles at the same time. So you can sort of see the left side, the right side, the straight ahead shot, even up at the top, this view, you know. But basically, the set of abstractions that I'm using here are a little bit different than the abstraction. It's a combination of visual exaggeration, simplification, and conceptual abstraction. Now this painting is even more abstract. It's probably not even entirely clear what this is a picture of. In this case, I'm sort of exploring a little bit of the abstract expressionist approach to art making, trying to use paint to sort of express relationships between color and texture and so on. Um, Now, again, I started this painting sort of in this impressionist conversation. You can sort of see with the brushwork, it's sort of creamed on, sort of put on real thick, and the brush marks are extraordinarily important. But in the end, rather than trying to make it sort of about something in particular, I sort of liked its complete abstraction. The fact that it's not really necessarily anything. It's not a flower. It's not a hat. It's not a microscope. It's not a shovel and a bottle mixed together. This is really just a painting about paint. This is just paint. And because it's just paint, you have to explore it and experience it just for the fact that it is paint and for the relationship between the colors of the paint, between the different types of textures of the paint, between the arrangement and the composition of the paint, as opposed to just looking at it for some sort of conceptual meaning. In this case, we're looking at extreme abstraction. We're way on that far end of the abstraction scale because I'm not even trying to necessarily represent anything. Now, why is it that art is always being impacted by revolution? Why is it that major political upheavals or major scientific discoveries, why is it that these revolutions are impacting art so much? Well, I think it's kind of telling that many of you chose images such as the images of 9/11 or images of the iPhone as images that sort of represent your time. People are defined by the political moment that they're in, by the technological moment that they're in. People feel very connected to these things. And because they feel connected to these things, artists feel it's necessary to reference them somehow. Audiences feel that it's necessary for artists to be responsible for at least talking about them a little bit. World War I and World War II probably had as much impact on the nature of art as they did on the nature of politics throughout the world. World War I, of course, followed like one of the most prolonged areas of peace that Europe saw in the last couple of centuries. There was a huge lull in war, during which time the Impressionist paintings came out, and during which time a lot of these sort of soft, gentle, nice sort of art movements happened. But after the First World War, you end up with a different type of art, a type that's very driven by anarchy and driven by this sort of like angst and sort of pain and sort of creative, psychological sorts of approaches. People that saw large-scale, catastrophic death sort of came back and were just sort of really, really interested in pushing around some of these more ugly thoughts, some of these more heinous thoughts. Going into World War II, there was one of these sort of like most beautiful times to be in Paris, with extraordinarily creative, huge groups of artists sort of working together, collaborating with one another, and pushing ideas back and forth. The cafes and the salons were extraordinary melting pots of creativity. Now, right in the middle of World War II, of course, the Germans invaded Paris, France. What was the center of the art world was of extraordinary interest to Adolf Hitler. He was a failed artist to a certain degree, and he had a lot of sort of pent-up aggression towards the art world at that particular point. He wanted Paris. It was the jewel in his crown to a certain degree. In fact, as the Nazis were approaching, the French mayor essentially went out and made a deal with the advancing armies, which he took a lot of flack for because he basically surrendered the city of Paris to the Nazis. And of course, he took a lot of flack for this, but as far as he was concerned, he thought it was more important to preserve Paris than it was to fight and possibly completely destroy the city in the process of defending it. Now, the ironic thing, of course, is that as the Nazi armies were rolling down the main boulevard towards the Louvre, they arrived at the Louvre and found it completely empty. The French had essentially gone in, taken all of the important paintings that were stored in the Louvre and hid them throughout the mountains in the south. So what happened to this beautiful art scene that was in Paris after the Nazis took over? Well, A number of the artists sort of waited it out, sort of laid low. Some, of course, were hauled off by the German army to death camps or whatever, and a number of other folks, of course, just evacuated. There was not very many places to actually evacuate to. There was war on almost every continent, in North Africa, throughout Europe, throughout Asia, Australia. Pretty much the only place that was safe where you weren't going to actually be dealing with invasion or with dealing with the Nazi army, of course, was America. One of the major ports of call was New York City. So a bunch of folks jumped on boats. Now, not to say that all artists did, but there was a lot of folks that evacuated. And a lot of art critics and a lot of writers and so on sort of made their way over to New York, at least to wait out the war. Now, when the war ended, America won. And when America won, now all of a sudden they're in charge of telling the new history. One of the things that I learned, of course, in my conflict between art and history is that not all history is the truth. But in many cases it's the truth, or at least the story written by the person who won the war, by the person who made the most money, by the person who had the most power. And so, of course, America won the war, so they get to start writing the next chapter.